Hi, y'all. Can you hear me okay? Sort of, yeah? All right. So thanks for coming out to this event. We're going to be here my name is Tara. I'm the Executive Director of the Illinois Disciples Foundation, and I'll be introducing our speaker tonight. The issue we're going to be discussing is one that's literally a life and death issue, namely the oppression of Palestinian people. So again, like I said, my name is Tara. Illinois Disciples Foundation is a peace with justice organization that has about a century behind it of human rights activism. And we're going to open tonight's event with a little information about the organizations that brought in our speaker. Our speaker's name is Hatem Abudayyeh. He's going to speak for about a half hour, 40 minutes, and then we're going to do questions and answers from the audience after that. We're going to handle questions and answers. If you didn't get a note card yet, on the front table, we can pass one to you, just because it'll make things more orderly. So once we're done with 10 minutes of speech, we're going to get the note cards and give them to him for questions. So the organizations that co-sponsored this event are the IDF, the Illinois Disciples Foundation, Progressive Resource Action Cooperative, and the Students of Palestine. The Illinois Disciples Foundation, like I said, has almost a whole century behind it of activism. We've been involved in the civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War protests. We're involved in the anti-cheat movement, women's rights movement, all kind of stuff. And most of our work is done through our programs. One of the programs that's co-sponsoring tonight, the Progressive Resource Action Cooperative, again, is that they mainly run anti-chief issues. PRC, it's a multi-issue, multi-tactical, direct action organization. They've been and the Students of Palestine, the registered student organization, which works to promote awareness and educate people on issues pertaining to Palestine. All the organizations should have literature on the table for all websites to check out. So now, Hatem is a Palestinian American community activist and youth director in Chicago. Much experience and knowledge on dynamics, history, and misrepresentation of the Palestine. Hatem will speak on the Intifada of Israel and the U.S., the oppression that led to the Palestinian uprising. Let's give him applause.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Tara McCauley and the Illinois Disciples Foundation. I can't get myself to say the acronym for the IDF, the forces, and as we really much of a defense force, Israeli forces are for territories in September, and most of I got to speak tonight. Also, thank you to Students for Palestine. One of their members was kind of welcome us to Champaign Day. In Chicago, I work with two different organizations. The organization that hires and pays me is the Arab Action Network. And that's basically a community-based social service organization that works that does advocacy for Arab immigrants and Arab Americans in the greater Chicago. We have youth programs, we have family empowerment, we do case management, domestic violence prevention, things of that nature. In essence, what we do is we try to advocate for them. We try to fight discrimination and racism at all levels of the Arab immigrant and Arab. The other organization I work for is the Committee for a Democratic Palestine, and that's the organization that is basically at the forefront of most of the activism in Chicago since September 28th, since the outbreak of the Intifada. Our center has hosted many teach-ins, symposiums, workshops, educational events, talking about the history of the region, the history of the conflict, and how it's brought about rising. The Committee for a Democratic Palestine is different than most organizations in that it's a democratic, secular organization, which was important for the community in the Palestinian struggle, the extra sector, and then there's what we call moderate sector represented by the Palestinian Authority. So the CDP was formed in the 70s. For a few years, it hasn't been functioning, and now we're back in the scene, working to educate the entire North American population about the issue of human rights violations, brutal on our people. It's important when we talk about what in Palestine that we take a historical perspective. Many of you may know most of you probably do know the origins of conflict, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it right now. Lots of people qualify as a Jewish someone or as a Jewish Palestinian, but the essence of the conflict is one that comes from political ideology. And that political ideology is Zionism. Now, Zionism, the French Congress, was in 1800. The father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, he was a Swiss Jew, but he was a very religious Jew. Movement as a religious movement, and a political movement. When they talked about a home for the Jewish people, they didn't necessarily Palestine, because Palestine was the chosen home for Jews. They had possibly Argentina, they had suggested Uganda in Africa. It turned out of imperialist involvement, they decided that Palestine would be best because they could have a stronghold in a region rich in natural resources, obviously oil being the number one among them. The ideology says, one of the main quotes attributed to Zionism is, we want to find within. In essence, what they're saying, is that the Zionist organization, we're saying that this piece of land called Palestine had no on it. The millions of Palestinian Arabs live in that region, non-entity. And so we, Jewish, from everywhere in the world, from any country, come there to our national home. In essence, that itself is a racist notion. A notion that a Jew from Poland being and a Jew from Ethiopia has more rights to a land where people have been liberated than those people that are there. It was a national liberation movement, interesting that as a supported imperialist powers as its patrons, and a majority of the people, which means that national liberation movements believe in self-determination. Obviously, when you expel people in the country, that goes against all ideas of self-determination. So in 1917, the Jews formed the imperialist power that helped them at that time, and that was the state separated the Arab world after World War I. The French, a lot of the states colonized the Arab states, and the British colonized some others. So the British at that time had a mandate in Palestine. And what Lord Balfour did, he declared a national home in Palestine. Was it because Balfour and believed that they were being oppressed and rest in the European nations? Probably not. Most of that representation was because British imperialists wanted a stronghold in the Middle East, and they found that they could have that stronghold. They supported a Jewish nation in Palestine. And they allowed almost unrestricted Jewish immigration into Palestine. Obviously, the Palestinians saw that they did immigration. They felt a threat to their very being. And the Intifada started then in 1960. It was a 3-year series of boycotts and strikes, some passive resistance against these Jewish immigrants and also against the British repressive. After 1939, it was violently put down. Hundreds of lives were lost, dozens were injured. And to speak about the 1987 Intifada being the first one, in 1936, people that before the establishment of the Zionist state in 1988 was resistance to this unrestricted immigration, to this expropriation of land, even before 67's occupation and even before the 1948 establishment of the state of Israel. 1947, the UN, they did was they had a partition plan. Now, the reason for the fate of the Palestinians and the fate because Britain, World War II, really didn't have to remain the guiding force in Palestine to remain strong. They gave up their mandate. They turned it on, and the UN at that the struggles of the Palestinians and the new Jewish immigrants had done to Britain. What they did to this plan. Partition plan gave the Jewish state 55% of the land of historic Palestine. Even though Jews had only maybe 25% of the population and only 6%. Since the UN self-determination gave to over half of Palestine, even though they own 6% of the land. And our second imperialist power decided that they would be the new patrons for the state of Israel, and it was the United States. The first statesman to immediately when they declared independence in 1948, and the U.S. remained imperialist power in the world, that they wanted that same stronghold in the Middle East because of that, the natural resources, the oil, that could bring the United States multi. What happened then between 1907, the Petition Plan, and 1940 was a lot of myth that time says that had a very tiny army, that they were surrounded and they were attacked by all these major Arab armies in the region. Those myths have been proven to be false by being historian, Israeli news historian. In Palestine itself was far greater the Arab military in Palestine. If you count all the military of all the all the states, it would be true that Israel had less of a fighting force. But within Palestine itself, where the fighting was happening, Israel had many more resources. They had built their military machine with the help of Great Britain through the some years of immigration. And it wasn't as if it was a David and Goliath sort of. The Israeli, the bigger army, had more resources. They were powerful. And in essence, after the war, it turned out that Israel got 70% of the land that the UN partitioned. And are we talking about it as a military escapade, also as one of the worst human rights violations? Called 800,000 Palestinians were expelled from their lands, forced into refugee camps in Lebanon, in what we now call the West Bank, the Strip, and Jordan. Now, 800,000 people who basically were forced from their homes, basically living in exile since 1948, and basically don't have the right to return to those homes and those that they were from. A lot of the talk of the Oslo Accords ignored the plight of refugees, and that this is the most important issue, and it's the only thing that would lead to a comprehensive peace, is the right of return for these refugees to the homes and the lands that they were forced from. I'll get back to that a bit later. The right of return is a lot of discussion. After 48, there was another war in 56, but what happened in 1967 is something that greatly affected the Palestinians as well. Another, which brought 400,000 more refugees and ended in the elimination of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory. Israel, at that time, they annexed East Jerusalem. Today, about sovereignty over Jerusalem. Not only did Israel annex East Jerusalem, but they annexed 28 founding villages. So Jerusalem is not boundaries, made it a bigger Jerusalem, and it was annexed into Israel. Thus now, sovereign Jerusalem. They talk about giving administrative control, possibly, to the Palestinians of the holy sites, religious sites. But they don't talk about the fact that the 28 other surrounding villages that surround Jerusalem proper were also annexed. And they have no intention of turning over sovereignty of those 28 villages in East Jerusalem back to the Palestinians. UN Security Council resolutions at the time immediately called for the withdrawal of Israel's troops from the occupied territories. Immediately. That was 1967. We're in 2001. 34 years later, they still have from the territories. They're still illegally occupying the territories. UN Security Council resolution called for this withdrawal, and even the United States at that time didn't veto it. So basically, fighting international law for over 34 years. Now, I want to describe occupation. A lot of times, to a lot of people, occupation is just a political term. What exactly does it mean? In the case of the Palestinians, what it means is restriction of movement. Basically, Palestinians in the West Bank cannot go to Gaza. Palestinians from Gaza cannot go to the West Bank. West Bankers cannot travel even Friday, the most holy day, to pray. And even Palestinian Christians cannot travel to Jerusalem on Sunday, the Christian holy day, to pray. There are checkpoints between the West Bank towns and Greater Jerusalem. Restricted movement also means that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza must always carry IDs that so indiscriminately at any time ask us to look at IDs to see that they're the right spot, make sure that they're not illegally in the West Bank or illegally in Jerusalem. I'm an American citizen. I was born in Chicago, but when I visit Palestine, I'm a West Banker like everybody else. I am stopped everywhere I go and asked to see identification. I have to show my passport in the West Bank to Jerusalem. My cousins, when they take me to Jerusalem on the holy day, they have to stay behind. They're not allowed to go past that checkpoint. Okay, these are examples of occupation that Palestinians have been living with since 1967. I'll discuss about what occupation means now after the current uprising. But also, occupation is also an example of collective punishment. Now, when people have lived under occupation for 34 years, when people live under occupation for 1 year, you get to a point in your life where you no longer accept making decisions about your life. That is it. In disrespect is the ultimate dehumanizing. And what Palestinians have had to live with is a policy of collective punishment. Whenever there's any kind of restriction, any kind of immediately place a siege on villages, they impose curfews, they close towns, people can get from village to village. The type of occupation that we're talking about, military occupation, foreign people's soil. Now, what that brings you to ultimately, something that I'm sure most people, most rational people would say is justifiable, and that is resistance. Resistance to this occupation, resistance to this, and I think that's what happened in 1987 in the Second Intifada, and it lasted five full years. Now, collective punishments that we talk about are the curfews and the sieges, but also house demolitions. The Israelis like to do is call some sections of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip secure areas. These areas of land need their security, so to speak. The security of the illegal settlements that have been built on Palestinian land since 1967 as well. Now, to seize that land that belongs, and to demolish homes on that land for bypass roads, or we need this for a road that leads from settlement. These house demolitions and these appropriations of land are blatant human rights violations. They're blatant violations of the Geneva Convention, the international law of UN security. And because the largest patron for the Israeli government is the United States, and our tax dollars are going to billions per year on this occupation, the fund military hardware that goes to the occupation. So that's why I believe that Americans speak out about this occupation, because it's really our money, and it's that is funding this occupation, and it's funding the dehumanization of people in Palestine who have lived there and lived on land and sold that land for generations. The Oslo Accords. After the Second Intifada in 87, after it ended between 91 and 92, a segment of the Palestinian leadership was in secret negotiations with the Israelis in Oslo. What came out of that negotiations is probably the worst that has happened to the Palestinian people. In essence, the Israelis accepted what we call a Palestinian authority to administer the occupied land, basically legitimizing the occupation. Administering the land, meaning not responsible for security concerns, responsible for basic administration, civil administration, while Israel can secure apparatus in the West Bank and in Gaza. It was separated into 3 sections, and each A was supposed to be Palestinian and authorized by the Palestinian Authority and led by the Palestinian Authority. The Israelis could go into those 8 areas at any time they perceived what they called the security threat. Now, the problem with Oslo is that they dealt with interim Palestinian leadership in the occupied territories without talking about the three issues: the right of return of Palestinian refugees to the land that, from which they were usurped in 1948. They didn't talk about Israeli Jewish settlements, and they didn't talk about the status of Jerusalem, sovereignty of Jerusalem. So for an interim agreement, the starting comes to a head in 2000 without dealing with those main issues, the main issues that bring about peace. That was the failings of Oslo. They were the failings of government who believed that they could legitimize. Now, this remain heavily bypassed between settlements remain under Israeli sovereignty. A lot of times, all the wonderful questions that Barak made to Arafat in the last months of his rule, but I want to read to you a little bit about those concerns. Barak, who writes for the Independent, talked about a sham summit which promised David meetings between Barak, Arafat, and Clinton. Having claimed in the past that Israel was offering 92% of the West Bank and then 94% to the Palestinians, the Americans insisted that the latest proposals give Mr. Son. A careful reading of the Clinton document proves this to be untrue. With the Dead Sea waters that would become Palestinian territory, with the Israeli army buffer zone of the Kiryat Arba settlement land, with the exclusion of the West Bank land illegally annexed into Jerusalem by the Israelis, including the massive Ali Adin settlement, was still likely to get no more than 60%. The Palestinian Authority knows all about what control would mean in Israel. While Arafat's men collected garbage, supplied the traffic cops, their own people in order, the Israelis were in power over all Jerusalem. This isn't a new way of the Israelis. It's not that. But acceptance of this two-state solution would mean a number of things. Specifically, it would mean an end to this historical conflict. The two-state solution would mean that the Palestinians have a state on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Israelis have their state in the rest of historical Palestine. But what it would do, what the United States wanted so much for it to do, is that it would ultimately open the Arab markets to the Israeli economy, to Israeli area, and pretty free Egypt. In essence, this historical Arab-Israeli conflict and open up huge, vast markets for corporations and for U.S. corporations. That's why was struggling so hard to get before he left office. A deal that would mean much to national U.S. corporations, it would just mean more cheap Arab labor for the Israeli and Israeli corporations. The uprising started in September 28. It has most of the same things that earlier, and it has the same sort of repressive message from the Israelis, probably tenfold. We have seen on the Palestinian territory since 1967. 400 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza Strip with the Israeli Arabs, the Palestinians that are in 1948. Over 15,000 have been injured. Over 2,000 of those permanent disabilities. Now, Amnesty International has suggested that some of this Israeli action could be construed at times. Live civilian population, sort of a medieval siege almost, basically tunnels so that people from one village cannot get into a village. Now, throughout the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, tunnels that are being dug and putting on siege, in essence, basically meeting points in every single village. Not get one. Some villages don't have grocery stores. Some villages don't have any place to get food or water or medical supplies or anything like that. So those villages under siege can't get to hospitals. They can't get to food. Again, between Gaza and the West Bank, of course. There's no movement between Gaza and Jerusalem, West Bank and Jerusalem. Now, the military technology used in the current Intifada, tanks, Israel's rolling tanks into villages to suppress this legal occupation. Apache helicopters that are used to fire and villages are made by the United States. The tanks are US made. The technology and the financial assistance that goes to the military is from the United States. So, we follow Israel, we talk about its human rights violations, we talk about all the international laws that they have flouted. The United States is complicit in these violations. The United States is complicit in the killing of Palestinians, in the maiming of Palestinians. I want to read a figure from the Intifada. Some economic figures as well as of injured dead. This is by the HDP, which is the Health Development Information and Policy Institute. They work very closely with Palestine. They work closely with the Internet Cross and with some of the economic education problems that are caused by this the Israeli violence. 450 Palestinians were detained. And when we say detained, we're talking about a policy of administrative detention. Israel is to be this beacon in a world that had none, in a region that had none. But when you talk about administrative detention, basically any Palestinian who is to be a threat to the security of the individual, a leader, an activist, a teacher, a pastor, can be detained for 6 months without any form of charge. There is absolutely no due process when it comes to the Israeli judicial system. So when we say detained, that's what we mean, administratively detained. 450 Palestinians inside the 1948 Palestinians that stayed behind in 1948. 1,000 Palestinians detained for East Jerusalem, West Bank, and the Strip. The shelling of residential areas. Extensive damage to 2,760 buildings, 773 homes, 108 completely demolished, 10 mosques, 12 churches, 44 water wells, cemeteries, 25,000 olive and fruit trees uprooted. Now, for the Palestinian, olives are basically the cash crop. 25,000 olive trees uprooted, and essentially the economy of this peasant part of Palestine. Education. Another example, 41 schools closed or unable to operate. 20,000 students affected. 4 schools turned to military barracks. 3 schools were shelled and fired upon by Israeli soldiers. $400,000 damage in 8 weeks. 45 Palestinian students killed during the first 2 months, mostly on their way to schools. UNRWA schools reported 1,800 lost school days from September 28 to November 18. Most of these figures are up to date up to March. Other examples of collective punishment, specifically executions. The total cost them $12,700,000, a 51% drop in the gross national product. Israel prevents 125,000 of work. We talked about the siege on the villages, where people sometimes can't go to a village and get food, get water. A lot of times, for emergency medical purposes, they're not allowed to get in, which has the best facility, the best hospitals. Also, preventing daily 100 from going to work. So not only are we talking about oppressive occupation that is killing people daily and is maiming and injuring people daily, we're also talking about crushed economy of the Palestinian territories. And it's more visits out for self-determination, more strong. Is 6 million to unemployment rate right now is 48%. And over 1 million Palestinians live below the poverty line, doubled from the Intifada. Entire losses to the national Palestinian economy are estimated at 2. Now, a lot of discussion in the last 6 months or so has been about the human rights violations. A lot of discussion has been about the killing of innocent civilians and the flouting of international law. I think these figures are there in Palestine. People affected, where maybe don't come out too much in the media. Obviously, not American media. A little bit better in Europe, possibly. But that'd be to the next section I want to talk about a little bit, and that's media misrepresentation. The Chicago Sun-Times studies have been done since September 28th. Over 99% of the editorials and the commentaries from the Sun-Times have placed all the blame on the uprising, on the Palestinian Authority, on the Palestinian. They perpetuate this racist notion that Palestinian mothers and Palestinian fathers are throwing their children in the front to gain some type of sympathy from the international community. The Chicago Tribune, but they've been a little more even-handed in their editorials and commentaries. Studies have been done with the Washington Post, More Sun, the New York Times, and all have unwavering, almost unequivocal, and the repression of the Palestinians as security concerns for the state of Israel. Now, I just want to read from the Guardian newspaper. He wrote an article called Israel Wins. And I just want to read a couple passages from here. It describes how perpetrates this Palestinians are savage and they're barbaric. The Israelis even more to quell the uprising. The electronic newspaper archive contains all dates plus the London Evening Standard. A search of this revealed 1,669 during the 12 Bank. 49 contained the phrase occupied West Bank. A further 513 include the word occupied or occupation elsewhere in the text. That leaves 1,107 stories, 66% total, which managed to talk about the West Bank without mentioning of the key facts. Also, search of the archive highlighted a practice which has similar effects. Mainly live in communities. Palestinians live in Greece. Palestinian areas scored 100 mentions over the last 12 months. Neighborhoods scored 15, communities 3. In the case of Jews, the positions were communities scored 87, neighborhoods 30, and areas 21. It's clearly not intentional, and it may be partly due to the way we speak of Jewish communities. The overall pattern suggests perception, perhaps an unconscious one, that Palestinians are civilized. The factor is that neighborhood and burlesque are used as settlements. Israeli spokesmen regularly describe the settlement neighborhood of Jerusalem because it has been unilaterally annexed. A recent report in the tradition of seeing regard Gilo as an illegal settlement. Indeed they do, but then international law. So these examples of the media misrepresentation of the conflict also, I think, are very complicit with the United States government in what's happening to the Palestinian people today. A few more things. I just want to talk a little bit about the right of return. Talk about what we do as a community in the United States, what you can do as a campus specifically to and try to stop human rights abuses. We said in 1948, 48,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes in C7 world. Now, Resolution 194 at that time specifically spoke to the Palestinian refugee issue and said that Palestinians must be able to return at the earliest practicable date. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that refugees from their homes have the right to return to their homes. Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 13, specifically says the same thing. Now, we talk about a two-state solution, and we talk about why Israel wants the two-state solution, since they want this two-state solution. But we don't talk about the human rights of those 800,000 who were killed out in 1948. They now make up over almost 5 million people, which is the largest refugee population in the world. Now, to talk about a comprehensive solution to the Israeli conflict without talking about those 5 million people who live in refugee camps, which are absolutely unbearable. Infrastructure for the medical supplies, educational supplies are almost non-existent. Food are horrible. Living in absolute dire conditions, destitute, high unemployment, and still generations of Palestinians live in countries that aren't theirs, forced from the land they lived on, forced from the homes they lived in. So it's important to realize that, besides even the status of Jerusalem, given the status of the settlements, which must also be dismantled, and occupation must end on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem before there can be a comprehensive peace. Those 5 million Palestinians must be allowed to return to their country. Now, arguments from the Jewish side that says, well, if we allow these 5 million people to come back, what will that do to our existence? What will that do to our Jewish state? Well, we talked about political Zionism. We talked about the essence of a Jewish state is a state for Jews which excludes non-Jews. If it excludes non-Jews, then allowing Palestinian refugees to return and changing the entire face of this state, to me, doesn't seem like something that should be construed as a negative. Allowing those 5 million Palestinians to return home will about, I think, only legitimate chance for a comprehensive peace is one country, democratic, secular, and non-sectarian.
Okay, so now we're going to do question and answers. So did everybody get your note cards and a pencil to write down your questions? If not, raise your hands. We can get you some. Okay, so if you could just pass your note to the edge of the aisle and to the back, we'll have somebody pick them up and pass them up to Hatem. So I guess I want to also announce Palestine Awareness Week. There are other events going on this week. On Monday, there's a speaker and exhibit. The speaker is Kifa Mustafa. He's going to be speaking Israeli independence of Palestinian oppression. It's going to be at 24 Buell Hall, 6 p.m. There's flyers for this outside the table, at the other table over there. The photos is going to be in the Illini Room C. It's photos and essays by Palestinian refugee children. Friday is this a speaker, Lisa? There's a speaker on Islam and Palestine, significance of Jerusalem. This is at 16 Lincoln. Could you say that a little louder? Okay. Did you all get that? So hopefully the note cards are getting back up here. I also want to see if I could pass around a donation basket. The organizations have brought Hatem in a lot of funding. So if you mind getting a little money to give to respective organizations that Hatem with in Chicago, that'd be great. So I guess that's it. Are the note cards coming up? Yeah.
This first question is good because it'll bring me to a that I missed. What are the chances of Arab worldwide Islamic boycott of Israel or by other nations who support Israel? One of the things I wanted to talk about when we talk about activism, what we can do about these human rights as a campus community and just as a community at large. There's a project going on at the University of California at Berkeley, what they're calling a divestment campaign, similar to the worldwide boycott of the apartheid government in South Africa, but it's starting on a campus scale. Now, what they're doing is they've gotten the charter of the University of California at Berkeley. They've read all the bylaws, and they've realized that in that charter, it specifically mentions the fact that the university shall do no business at all with nations that violate human rights and that violate international law concerning human rights. So what they're doing basically is saying, we have that diversity, and since Berkeley invests money in Israeli organs and gives money to universities in Israel, that that they should stop that charter. So that's one of the things that maybe we as a campus here in Champaign, or you here at the University of Illinois, can think about doing. Think about pressuring the administration here at the University of Illinois into, if they're doing business with Israel, that they should definitely stop, because it has to be at the University of Illinois as well, that they shall do no business with things that violate human rights laws. The chances of a worldwide Islamic boycott, I don't necessarily want to call it an Arab boycott, Islamic boycott. I'd like to think that consciousness throughout the world would think about boycotting Israel and Israeli products because of their blatant violations of international law and because of the rights violations against the Palestinians. Already, it has started on a small scale, sub-Arab nations, maybe divestment campaigns on American campuses could become something bigger in the community at large. We've seen what it's done to South Africa, but we also have to realize the imperialist power that is very secure in its relationship with, and that's the United States. So it's a different sort of dynamic than, the worldwide boycott of South Africa and apartheid. But I think the start at Berkeley is a good one. The start in some of the Arab nations is definitely a divestment project, is something that definitely could. Are people dying of thirst? It's interesting that question is. When you talk about this in the West Bank, Israel controls the water resources in the West Bank and Gaza as well. I mean, I don't know, I don't have specific figures of people who may not be dying of thirst, but I know that Israel controls the water resources. Israeli settlers, Jewish settlers who live in those settlements, those illegal settlements in the have all the water that they possibly can, while Palestinians who live in neighboring villages have their water basically quarantined. So I don't know the specific numbers of people who may be dying. I don't think people are dying of thirst, but I do know that there's definitely not an equitable distribution of water resources in the Palestinian occupied territories. What is the estimate of the number of people who die because they can't get? I know for a fact the International Red Cross and the Palestinian Red Crescent Society mentioned that three Palestinians who couldn't get to a hospital in Jerusalem died just last week. I don't know the exact figure, but up until March 15, there are now 5 million refugees. Is it from natural increase or from more expulsion? That's 5 million is the 8,000 from 48, the 400,000 from 67, and their descendants who have grown up in those refugees. Who are the Palestinian people? A Palestinian authority who you claim to have made a large mistake, or more radical group, Hamas. That's an interesting question. I think Palestinian people in Palestine, I don't know if they necessarily have any specific group or faction of the resistance. I think they identify with the resistance at large, the resistance movement that is fighting occupation, the resistance movement that is fighting these human rights violations and I think that's what Palestinians, the majority of Palestinians would say, that that they identify with the greater resistance. What role, if any, did variables such as race, class, and gender play in recent events in the Middle East? Is there a common concept of peace or of just hope for the future? And what can we here in Champaign do to help matters? I think I answered the second part of the question when I answered the first question that we had here. The first question, though, is if any variables such as race, class, or gender play in recent events in the Middle East. When you talk about class in Palestine, you talk about a peasant class in Palestine. They are the people mostly affected by this, the recent Israeli violence and by the movement. Most of the young men who go out and demonstrate against the Israeli occupation are young men who are probably struggling to find jobs, who a lot of them were from descendants first of the Second Intifada in 1987, when schools were closed and a whole third of the population wasn't able to go to school and wasn't able to complete school. So now, because of the poor infrastructure in Palestine, because of the poor economic conditions, unemployment rate being 48%, I mean, it's mostly those young men and women who are oppressed in Palestine now. Do Israeli Arabs have more rights than Arabs living in? First of all, the term Israeli Arabs was forced upon Palestinians by Israeli colonist government, colonialist government. So I don't use Israeli Arabs, not because it's my choice, but it's because the Palestinians that live in the 48 territories, they don't consider themselves Israeli. So I don't think that we should call them Israeli Arabs. The Palestinians in 1948, I'll assume it means, have more rights than Arabs living in Syria. Palestinians in 1948 cannot buy land, cannot buy homes, because they are non-Jews. The average per capita income per capita for a Palestinian in 1948 is about a quarter of what it is for Israeli Jews in the 1948 territories. So I don't think they live as third-class citizens. Their rights in the Israeli judicial system is similar to the rights of blacks in apartheid South Africa. It's similar to the rights of communities of color and young of color in the United States judicial system, the prison system. So I don't think that Palestinians from the 1948 territory have more rights than the Arabs in Syria. How do you respond to the whole thing as a mess? That land has been in dispute for 2,000 years. What I would say is it may look like it's a mess. And for the people who are living there, I'm sure that they would also call it a mess. But I was hoping that this presentation will give you a historical perspective that is different from a biblical perspective or a biblical discourse. I'm talking about human rights violations that were imposed on indigenous peoples by a colonialist power with the support of imperialist powers, Great Britain and the United States. I'm not talking about who lived in Palestine 25 years ago. I'm talking about illegal occupation on Palestinian land. I'm talking about 1.2 million people by a greater military power and not allowed to come back, which is against against all international law convention. That's what I'm talking about. Maybe would people of conscience as us would speak up more often, would send letters to editors when we see that commentaries and editorials are not even-handed, would go out to the Israeli consulate and march and rally and demand that the occupation is ended, demand that Palestinians have their self-determination, and demand that Palestinians have the right to return to their homes. President George Bush announced he will be recalling U.S. troops, i.e. peacekeeping teams, from the Sinai. How will this affect the Palestinian crisis? I did not hear that. When did he announce that?
About 2 days ago.
Oh, really? You know what? I really, if I guess, I don't think that would affect the crisis too much. What I think would affect the crisis a little bit more is the last resolution that was suggested in the UN Security Council, which the United States, of course, vetoed, which asked for unarmed UN peacekeeping forces in the occupied territories, observer forces, and the United States vetoed that. The United States is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. When they veto a Security Council resolution like that, it automatically gets dropped. So, another example of how the United States can't be a mediator in the issue, that they can't be even-handed, that they can't be fair-handed, and that, it has to, this conflict, if it's to come to a resolution, that the international community has to get involved, and the UN has to get involved, and cut the U.S. altogether out of this, the so-called peace process. Can you elaborate on the obvious separation between the position of the PA and the will and rights of the Palestinian people? Separation both in negotiating as well as everyday actions under the continued illegal occupation. There is a separation between the position of the PA and the will and rights of the Palestinian people. But I think the will of the Palestinian people since September 28th has, in essence, maybe not for, has in essence has allowed the Palestinian Authority to become more democratic in its processes and accede to the will of the Palestinian people and accede to the major negotiating points, which are the right of return, the status of the illegal settlements, and the status of Jerusalem, and obviously the end of occupation. But although those major issues weren't mentioned in Oslo immediately, they weren't part of the interim agreement. They were going to ultimately be a part of the final status negotiations. I think it's a good example of the will of the people forcing democratic change and forcing democratic processes. Could you further elaborate on how a husband and wife could not live together if one carried Jerusalem ID and the other did not? In that situation, it'd be similar to, this is just from my experience of being of being there the last couple summers. In this situation, a person who had a Jerusalem ID would apply for his or her spouse, just as a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident here would apply for a permanent resident to become a resident. That's what would happen. Could you elaborate on how Israel created the perception for the necessity of more bypass roads and settlements leading to more confiscation of Palestinian lands, creating facts on the ground to attempt negotiations? Interesting. That was one of the quotes I was going to use, but I didn't get a chance to, so I'm glad you used it. The facts on the ground that Ariel Sharon spoke about as the housing minister maybe 10 years ago. He talked about creating facts on the ground, building more settlements on Palestinian land, building more bypass roads, putting more of the Israeli military around these settlements, how they created the perception. I don't think they created any perception. I don't think the international community has accepted at all that they've needed more of these settlements and more of these bypass roads. I think, in essence, because the United States has allowed them to basically unilaterally make decisions in Palestine, in the occupied territories, that they're able to do that without any kind of censure. So I don't think that they created any perception in anybody's, in any really thoughtful person's mind, and they need more bypass roads and they need more security for those illegal Jewish settlers. Can you elaborate on the practices of torture and interrogation during administrative detention? That's one of the things that only recently, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, did the Israeli Supreme Court finally consider torture and interrogation, torture at interrogations during administrative detention, to be illegal in Israel. So basically, since 1967, since the occupation until maybe 5 years ago, 30 some odd years, torture was legal. Torture of Palestinians in Israeli prisons was legal. It's Amnesty International, again the Palestinian Red Crescent Society and the International Red Cross has mentioned in reports that these torture tactics have returned with Palestinian dissidents in Israeli prisons. Elaborating on the practices, I mean, if you mean specifically what kind of torture tactics there are, is that what you're asking? Whose question was that?
No. I wasn't asking for specifics.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that it was, and that's why I specifically mentioned because in your talk you mentioned that a person could be basically imprisoned for 6 months, administrative detention, without any real accusation, without being guilty of anything. Well, beyond that, without being guilty of anything, that person then had to endure extreme torture. And that was just the point, the specifics I'm not interested in.
Okay, I think this is the last one. Which are the principal Palestinian requests? Can I take 2 more? Yeah? Is that all right? Which are the principal Palestinian requests to Israelis to have a peaceful coexistence and an improvement of the economy? I think the principal Palestinian request is that the refugees are allowed their right to return to their homes, that they get restitution for the land and the homes that they lost, that a law is fashioned for both Palestinians and Israeli Jews, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, Israeli Jews inside all of Palestine, with democratic principles, non-sectarian, secular state. I think that's the only thing that could lead to a peaceful coexistence, because, as we've mentioned before, a two-state solution, in essence, makes the Palestinians much dependent on Israeli economy. It is still, they still be repressed because of settlements, because of the fact that the Israelis would have sovereignty over, still have sovereignty over much of the West Bank and Gaza. And I believe that most Palestinians would say that peaceful coexistence would mean one democratic state for all. Last one. The media tries to spin itself as anti-corporation. Can you explain why they appear one-sided? Do they have a special interest? Well, I don't see... They may try to spin themselves as anti-corporation, but again, I think thoughtful people know that they probably aren't. They're one-sided. I don't know. I would suggest that, I'm sure some of you or most of you have read Chomsky. He talks a lot about the media and their complicity with U.S. foreign policy. He talks about the fact that the New York Times magazine, New York Times newspaper, and some other publications, Washington Post, and some others, are owned by General Electric, and General Electric has contracts for tanks and military in other countries, and that the media has a certain investment in perpetuating this state of war in the old days, the communist bloc, and now places like Iraq and to a lesser extent countries in South America or Central. I think they definitely have a special interest. I think they're definitely complicit to imperialist U.S. interests in the third world.
You mentioned Shanti. No,
Right.
I'm just going to mention to all of you people that as a very strong Palestinian activist for about 25 to 30 years, I have put books by another good author, Paul Finley. He wrote the book, They Dare to Speak Out, and Deceptions. I put them in Champaign and Urbana, and for your information, Paul was defeated by Senator Durbin in the House in 1980 because he dared to speak out on this thing. Your good Senator Durbin is one of the highest members of the Congress of the United States by Israeli AIPAC.
All right, thanks, y'all. And Hatem will be hanging around after a lot of questions that didn't get answered. Just come up and ask him. Just got a lit tape friend for more information. Hang around, talk to the organizers. Thanks again for coming.